Hi, everyone. Today's lecture is on the Risk Society, and it is entitled The Disenchantment of the Disenchanter, with a question mark. So what I'm going to do is kind of outline Ulrich Beck's Risk Society thesis, and then offer a sympathetic critique with some evidence. And yeah, I'll have some various points of editorialism throughout, I'm sure. All right. So according to Beck, just as modernity and the Enlightenment dissolved the social structures of feudal society in the 19th century and produced industrial society is now being dissolved into what he calls another modernity, which he characterizes as the risk society. For Beck, there's a dark side to modernity and the Enlightenment, and it's this dark side that is entering us into the risk society. So in modern industrial society, the production of goods and the distribution of wealth were of primary concern. Industrialization was based on technological and scientific innovations. These technological and scientific innovations were the product of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement, started in the 17th century, maybe even the 16th century, which brought us the scientific method. With the scientific method, we learned more about nature and physics. And through research and tinkering, we developed new technologies that made the mass production of goods, and especially food, available. And this obviously helped motor capitalism in the 19th century and build our economies, facilitated more intense globalization, and that's basically been the meta narrative right up until the 1980s. Beck would say that this is all good, but there's been unintentional processes along the way. So for him, he's saying that science, we'll say the Enlightenment, science and technology, has allowed us to grow society in the developed world and increasingly in the developed world. But this social transformation has created problems. So he calls these problems basically the mass production of hazards. So the Enlightenment, or science and reason, have produced worldwide hazards that impact everyone. And it's our relationship to these self-made hazards that is characteristic of what he calls the risk society. So when you think of things like nuclear radiation, gene manipulation in the food supply, industrial pollution, worldwide pandemics, although that's debatable, tainted food and commodities. These are all hazards that we face that are the actual unintended byproducts of science and technology. Right, so you can't have nuclear radiation at the levels that we have it outside of our ability to create it. So after a nuclear explosion or a meltdown of a nuclear reactor. So even though pandemics are natural, um, they spread more quickly when we have worldwide transportation that is cheap and efficient. But we can't really blame pandemics on modernization because human beings have faced pandemics for as long as we've domesticated animals. But we do have these issues of tainted food and commodities, which we'll talk more about in this lecture. So our industrial food system and our governments allow for a certain amount of toxicity in food and in commodities. So if you think of, most of you are probably listening to this in a room with drywall. Drywall has off gases, which means that it basically exposes us to toxins, whether you like it or not, whether your walls are painted or not. And our governments have allowed for this, and this has, these are not, or these are self-made risks insofar as it's only possible to have nuclear radiation, gene manipulation, industrial pollution, and food and commodity toxicity in an age where science creates the ability to do this. Right? So if you look even 150 years ago, very few of these things would have been an issue. So food purity, actually, interestingly, in the late 19th century, was an issue. That was one of the first waves of people's concern about the environment also coincide with a wave in people's concerns over trust in the industrial food systems way back over 100 years ago now. So for Beck, if the industrial society can be characterized as the production of goods, the modern risk society is the production of global risks or hazards. Now, to some extent, we now have greater control over or protection from the risks posed by nature. At least we are more knowledgeable of these risks. So because of scientists, we monitor the Earth to see if there's going to be an earthquake. We don't always get, a lot of forewarning when there's a major earthquake, but scientists are pretty good at telling us when there's going to be a volcanic eruption. They are pretty good to tell us when, about the weather and extreme weather in particular. So for Beck, he says that we have a greater knowledge of the natural world and the risks posed by the natural world, so much so that a lot of the risks that early humans would have faced, and even early modern humans, or even humans 150 years ago, are pretty much mitigated. So if you think of modern medical science, we're good at treating disease, we're good at preventing disease, we know more about germs and viruses and bacteria. So even 150 years ago, if you had a tooth infection, you were at risk of dying. Now, not so much, unless you are too poor to be able to get to a dentist. So for Beck, he says that in our modern risk society, the risks that we are exposed to are less likely to be natural risks that all humans throughout time have been exposed to. They're more likely to be risks that are the product of our own society. Now, in no small part, this taming of natural risks has been one of the great successes of the Enlightenment in rationality and science. Now, the result of the taming of risks is that we're an increased reliance on experts to inform us when we're at natural risk and to avoid their negative consequences. So if we are at natural risks, say from a virus, then we rely on experts to tell us the extent of the risk, and we rely on them to protect us and mitigate those risks if possible. So one characteristic of the risk society is that the expert takes on an important role in allowing the society to move forward. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So many of the hazards today, as I mentioned, are produced by modern societies and industrialization. So we have economic recessions that are only possible with a certain style of capitalism. We have pollution, radiation, unhealthy and fabricated foods, drug side effects, biochemical disasters, ozone depletion, global warming, depletion of finite resources and stuff like this, and damage to biodiversity. Well, all of these are produced by modern societies, and our knowledge of all of them is only based on the ability of scientists, social and natural scientists, to understand them. So we wouldn't know that we have high levels of pollution necessarily without climatologists telling us that, and chemists studying pollution and studying the chemical composition of pollution. If you look at radiation, well, you can't see radiation. By the time radiation is known to us outside of science, it's already too late. So one characteristic of the risk society is that we now have a super reliance on scientists to tell us when we're at risk, but also to protect us from those risks, whether they're natural or the product of the society themselves. Now, Beck does say that these risks are not personal risks, which means that everybody is at risk. So if you think of something like SARS, the original SARS, or mad cow disease in the 1990s, global warming, nuclear fallout, deforestation and its effects, water shortages, well, these have the potential to affect everyone. If you think about the radiation from Chernobyl or Fukushima, well, if you can't get out of the way quickly, all classes of people are going to be affected, right? So for Beck, he says a lot of these risks that we face in modern society are shared, insofar as your wealth might not be able to protect you from them. So rather than class position relative to the economy determining stratification, Beck argues that groups of people are inequitably positioned in relation to their risks in the risk society. The poor may be at more risk because they're less mobile than those who can afford to move away from risks, which creates an environmental injustice. So in the risk society, mobility and knowledge become a source of power and a source of inequality. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But here it's an important point that one way to protect yourself from contemporary risks is to be knowledgeable that they exist and knowledgeable of scientific information that you can draw into your personal life to allow you to minimize the damage from those risks. So if you understand modern nutritional science, which is a mess, honestly, it's really not up to the standards of real science, but we have dietary frameworks and health frameworks that, to more or less a good degree, can help keep yourself healthy, so you can have not only a long life but more years of living a healthy life, or living a lifestyle of mobility, basically. But outside of knowing that, you're at higher risk of shorter life and higher risk of disease and higher risk of fewer years of healthy living, if you just don't have the knowledge or the ability to implement your knowledge into your everyday practices. So we all know that there are certain foods that are quite bad for you that also tend to be inexpensive. And there are foods that are good for you that might be a little bit more expensive or harder to get in some neighborhoods. So some poor people may either not know the dietary and health standards that will allow them to thrive for many years, or they may know it but not be able to implement it. So knowledge and it becomes important. Mobility becomes important because if you are living in a community that has high levels of, say, water contamination, well, if you can't afford to move, you can. If you can't afford to move, you're stuck. So for Beck, he says that our subjectivity is permeated by an increased notion of risk and uncertainty. We are exposed to a bewildering array of information upon which we're supposed to base our decisions and act. And he says, well, this has to have some sort of psychological consequence, that we become insecure. And we become overly future oriented. We think about, well, how are our decisions today going to impact me in 40, 50, 60 years? And that probably wasn't the case even 150 years ago. People were more present. They were less future oriented. Beck then suggests that part of this kind of influence in our modern subjectivity is that as we become aware that the hazards of the risk society are the products of science and industry, we become more skeptical of science, technology, and industry, or at least our attitude towards them become more ambivalent. So he says we're kind of in this catch-22 where we rely on experts to inform us when we're at risk. We rely on experts to help us mitigate those risks. But we also rely on experts to give us all this great stuff we have in our societies. So modern technology is really outstanding, but the side effect is risk. Right? The side effect is we're not quite sure when we are going to become sick due to either the outcomes of industrial production or chemical production or what have you. So he says we get this problem of trust. If we can't trust science and experts fully, then we can't trust the Enlightenment and rationality fully, because this is the dark side of modernity, where the Enlightenment culture and rationality have given us a bunch of cool stuff, but has also created brand new risks from which we might not ever be able to return. So it's the increase in rationality that has created this whole mess. Okay. But at the same time, the only way to fix it is to rely even more on experts and expertise in science and rationality. For Beck, this mistrust of science undercuts many modern meta-narratives, such as the foundations of truth through the scientific method, which provides certainty for us. So he suggests that in the risk society, we have more ontological insecurity. Okay, so modernity replaced religious and supernatural explanations with scientific explanations. But for Beck, we're now experiencing what he calls the disenchantment of the disenchanter. So if science disenchanted religion, and if science disenchanted supernatural explanations, we're now in a period in human civilization or human history where we are becoming disenchanted with science because of this ambivalent position science has put us in. Okay, so that's the basis of the Risk Society thesis, and you should read the textbook to get more information about it. And I think Beck's ideas are attractive because they feel true at an intuitive level. Okay, and this is true of myself. So I read Beck's Risk Society. I think was published in English in 1984. He wrote it in the late 70s, which is a whole other problem in sociology or the social sciences in general, where we consistently adopt very, very old ideas and then we don't let them go. But a bigger issue is this idea that this theory feels true, but it's not scientific thinking. So Beck is not he was a social scientist, and he was a really good one. Like his ideas are well thought out and they seem plausible. But this is not science. Science requires theories that are falsifiable. And Beck himself never conducted research, strictly speaking, to try to falsify his own theories. He just redescribes the world in a particular way that is appealing and has been appealing to a lot of social scientists, and they base their research on these theories or his theories. Okay, so this type of kind of foundationless anti-scientific theorizing persists in sociology, making a large part of the repertoire of sociological knowledge basically ridiculous, especially when theoretical assertions are never tested appropriately empirically, or when people simply trust or pretend that the foundation of the theory is true. Okay, so for people who base their research on the sanctity of Beck's theories, they're basically just doing religious thinking. They're saying, well, let's assume that Beck's characterization of the world as a risk society where people are ambivalent about science is true. If we assume that's true, and then we do research on how people live within the risk society, the theory appears to be validated. But all the research that I've seen on Beck does not offer the opportunity to falsify his theory, to prove his theory incorrect. So if you think about hypothesis testing, you posit the null hypothesis that there's no relationship among the variables, and the first hypothesis might be that there is a relationship among the variables, right? And then you try to disprove or fail to disprove the null hypothesis. So that's a scientific method. It's the best method we know for trying to find the truth, or what is probably true about the world. But Beck has this particular, well, he was a German theorist, and again, very smart, and his ideas have influenced a lot of people, including myself. My master's degree was based on his ideas. But that style of sociology that he engaged in it's old-fashioned, honestly. So all he did is he sat in his, I'm sure he was more involved than this, but he basically sat in his office and tried to describe the world around him in new terms. Okay, which is fine. A lot of philosophers will do that, and a lot of theorists will do that. But as a social scientist, I'm more interested in, well, is it true? You know, is this exactly how the world works? And it's easy for us to find out. We just have to design good research to find out if this is how people experience the world. And if it is, then fine. Beck would be true, or Beck's ideas would be true. But if we don't do that, if we just do research that assumes he's right, and then we characterize people's activities as conforming to his theories, well, then we haven't actually created new knowledge that is true. We are just continually continuing to redescribe the world in new terms and saying that you've discovered something. And many of you have probably seen this. Some of you might like that type of theory. But many of you may have seen this in other sociology classes. So there's, especially I'd say in the sociology of gender, that's the best analog to, or the best, another example of where a whole subdiscipline of sociology is just based on armchair recharacterization of the world and ignoring all the real either social biological or social psychological research on gender differences, for instance. So you can go in almost any sociological field, unfortunately, especially in Canada, and see where a large proportion of what people are calling careful research, or a large proportion of studies that people are characterizing as scientific research, it actually isn't telling us anything new about the world. It's just redescribing the world. Okay. Now, again, a lot of people are attracted to that style of scholarship, but it's, to me, pretty easy to pick it apart and show that it just is a group of people who are agreeing to ignore some basic facts about about how social science should unfold. So that's my biting critique of Beck. That reading, so-called reading society through a certain lens of the risk society does not actually tell us what people are actually doing, what people are actually feeling in the contemporary world. So people need to ask basic questions. How do people really experience modern society and its risks? Do we really have an ambivalent view of science and expertise? If so, is it all of us or only some people? If it's some people, who are they and why are they ambivalent about science while other people aren't? Are people more ambivalent now than in the past? So if we can answer those questions through either qualitative or quantitative research, we'd be in a better position to say that Beck's theories are true or false. Okay, so I'm not going to give a lot of data right now, but it's not a scientific design. I just went to the Pew Research Center and looked at some of their research on people's perceptions of science in America. Okay, so one thing that I found right away was that between 1973 and 2018, confidence in the scientific community has been fairly stable, right? So we see almost a straight line. It squiggles a bit, and that's normal for any sort of social attitude. But for the most part, people are pretty confident in science. It's not, it's almost half and half. Like it's if 44% of American adults say they have a great deal of confidence in people running each of these institutions, scientific, medicine, stuff like that. 44, that's a little less than half, but this is a great deal. I'll show you some other numbers in a second that show that there's actually more people who have confidence. This is people who have great confidence. So right here we can say, yes, Beck doesn't seem to be capturing what's happening in real life, right? Now he might argue, well, if you draw a line further back in the past, then there's greater trust in science in the 1950s and 60s, and that's diminishing. Therefore, there's a downward trend, and people are either ambivalent or distrusting of science, right? So again, that's an empirical question. Another research, Gochat, in 2012 in the American Sociological Review, did a really cool study on public trust in science. And he found that for the most part, if you look at people's political leanings, that from 1974 to 2010, the period that he was studying, everybody's trust in science was about the same except for conservative Americans. Conservative Americans' trust in science went down, while everybody else stayed about the same, more or less. Okay, and I'll talk more about that in a second. I'm not sure when, but at some point. Okay, so we're seeing some evidence that trust in science is fairly constant. One political group in particular has a downward trajectory in their trust, which is good. That gives us something to to look into. Why are conservatives more distrustful of science than moderates or liberals? The fact that conservatives have less trust in science compared to moderates and liberals doesn't confirm Beck's theory at all, because Beck says everybody. He doesn't point out that there's a reason for conservatives to have less trust than moderates or liberals. He doesn't. There's nothing in his theory that would suggest that. Okay. Now you probably can't see this, but this is another part of Joe Schott's research. You might, in the slides, you might be able to zoom in on that. What he's finding, though, what I wanted to highlight is that for conservatives who have a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree, they have a fairly high trust in science. There's a positive correlation between years of education and trust in science. Women conservatives tend to have less trust in science than male conservatives. What else here? Non-whites have less trust in science compared to white Americans. Church attendance is negatively associated with trust in science, which makes some sense. Family income is positively associated with trust in science. Age is negatively associated with trust in science. So the older you are, the less trust in science you have. Age and conservatism interact. So we see that there are groups of people who maybe mistrust science more than other groups, but none of the patterns in this table are really in support of Beck's theory. Okay. So in this slide, this is going back to Pew Research Center. It's the percentage. It's the percentage of adults who say they have a great deal, fair amount, not too much, or none at all, confidence in each of the following groups to act in the best interest of the public. So this is basically a slide about trust in institutions. Okay. If we look at just Americans in general, we see that about 43% of Americans have a great deal of trust in medical scientists. 46% have a fair amount of trust in medical scientists. 39% of Americans have a great deal of trust in scientists. 48% have a fair amount of trust in scientists. So the overwhelming majority of Americans do seem to trust science and scientists, right? Now there's other people, like, so if you look at elected officials, people have mistrust of elected officials, which I think they have good reason to. People have, a fair amount of trust in business leaders, some trust in journalists, and so on and so forth. Now, as a social scientist, I feel like I should warn you that anytime you take a group of 380 million people, that's a pretty low resolution study, right? So you want to say, well, which Americans in particular vary? And this is where you'd want to go back to this type of research and find out how do a multivariate analysis and find out if there are particular subgroups in society who either trust science more or less, and then you ask why, right? Now in Beck's theory, you really don't have, he doesn't offer us any way to make a multivariate analysis. He just says everybody mistrusts science, or everybody has an ambivalent relationship to science, and because this is true, we feel ontologically insecure. Well, we would have to do the research, right? And the fact that his theory doesn't give us an indication on how to construct a multivariate analysis tells us that it's not set up to be falsifiable. Okay. What else do we have here? Americans' confidence in scientists America's confidence that scientists act in the public interest is up. So over time, and if you compare it to other institutions, the percentage or proportion of US adults who say they have a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in each of the following groups to act in the best interest of the public is actually increased. So between 2016 and 2019, we see a pretty sizable increase in the number or percentage of adult Americans who think that scientists are working in the best interest of the public. Well, to me, that absolutely refutes Beck's thesis, right? Because he would say that over time, we would be exposed to more and more risks. We would trust scientists less, or at least be more ambivalent. But that just doesn't seem to be the case. Now, we could be more fair to Beck and say, well, this could be true without disqualifying his theory, right? Because we could say, well, maybe people trust scientists, but they have concerns about the output of science. So maybe this is a wording problem. This next slide is about confidence in scientists, that confidence in scientists is growing among those with high science knowledge and among Democrats. So this confirms the other research from the American Sociological Review, that the more education you have, the more knowledge you have about science and the scientific process, the more trust you have. And the fact that Democrats trust scientists more than Republicans is consistent with what we know over the past 50 years almost, right? But again, if we look at a critique of Beck, there's nothing in Beck's theory that would account for why Republicans would mistrust science more than Democrats. And there's nothing in his theory that would tell us why there's a positive correlation between years of education and people's trust in science. Okay. So this is about people's perceptions about the dangers of certain forms of science or that are ongoing. So genetic engineering. So this is the percentage of people who think that changing a baby's genetic characteristics to reduce the risk of a serious illness that could occur over their lifetime is either appropriate or taking medical science too far. 60% of Americans believe that genetic engineering is appropriate to mitigate risk. Only 38% believe that that's taking medical technology too far. So I'm going to put a check there against Beck that, at least in America, Beck's theory doesn't seem to account because we would think that those numbers would be different. The next little bit here is on genetic engineering of animals to grow organs, tissues for humans in need of a transplant. Well, 57% say that that's appropriate, and 41% of Americans say that's taking things too far. There are putting a brain chip in your head to improve ability to concentrate and process information. 60% are worried about that, and 29% are not so worried. So yeah, and I can understand that. Like, you really want a computer chip in your head, but that again isn't necessarily a confirmation of Beck's theory, I don't believe. Okay, so you're getting the picture here, I'm assuming. The majority of Americans believe that science has a mostly positive impact on society. So 73% say that science is mostly positive. That's definitely does not confirm Beck's theory. Now this varies by race, but there's really nothing in Beck that would allow us to understand why this would vary by race. So among these broad racialized groups, we see that the vast majority say it's mostly positive, that science is mostly positive in its impact on society. If the risk society was true and we were cognitively aware of our ambivalence about society, these numbers would be all different. Okay? And again, the less knowledge you have about how science works, the less likely you're going to have an opinion about society or about science in society. Now, there's quite a bit of scientific illiteracy in America, which just means that Americans are not that interested in science. So in order to have an opinion about science, in order for people to believe that science has a positive or negative impact on themselves or their risks or on society at large, you actually have to think about science. A lot of people don't. And this is a bias you'd find in academic research, because academic researchers, social or physical sciences or natural sciences, chemical engineers, sociologists, psychologists, surround themselves with science. We tend to forget that we have a lopsided view of the world. So we assume that because we're interested in science, everybody's interested in science. That's simply not the case. So when you look at people's familiarity with scientists and their work, yeah, people understand about medical doctors because there's TV shows about medical doctors, but there's not a lot of TV shows about dietitians. That would be boring. People don't really care about medical research science that much. Therefore, they're not thinking about it and they don't know a lot about it. I'm surprised that only about 16% feel they know a lot about environmental research scientists and environmental research science and health science because of the news. But apparently that's the case. They probably just don't understand the complexity of environmental research science, which is probably true. I don't fully understand it either. This is interesting that people's source of information about science comes from the news media. Okay. Now, I think this is probably skewed because even though this survey was done in 2019, I suspect that most people's attitudes about science comes from social media now. But be that as it may, the news tends to be, the mass media tends to be the most common filter for what we know about science and what we know about scientists. And I just wanted to focus on environmental research scientists, that a large percentage of the American population have a mostly positive view of environmental health specialists and environmental research scientists. So again, you wouldn't, even with Beck's theoretical framework, there's no room in there to even ask this type of question because it's a very broad characterization of the contemporary world without he didn't, in his work, he doesn't look at any research on real people. He's just looking, trying to synthesize theoretical knowledge from other people who are just characterizing the world in a way that he does too. So Democrats are about twice as likely as Republicans to say environmental researchers regularly do a good job. Well, this is just because environmental science is cut and framed in the media along political lines. So if you are a conservative in the States, you might watch Fox News, or you might consume your news through Breitbart or other conservative social media, which routinely, as I mentioned in other lectures, disparage environmental research scientists as a matter of a coordinated social movement, the anti-environmental movement. So of course, the Republican-leaning folks are going to have a lower opinion of environmental researchers. This doesn't mean anything about the risk society, though, because as I mentioned, showed you in an earlier lecture, public opinion is manipulatable through collective action. So we have all these think tanks and public opinion lobby groups and stuff like this who are doing their best to ensure that conservative Americans don't believe that climate change is real or human caused, and are trying to ensure that environmental scientists are disparaged. Well, that has nothing to do, if the source of people's ambivalence about science is other groups of people trying to brainwash them, well, that has nothing to do with the risk society, right? That's another explanation for why someone might have an ambivalent view of science. So again, these are empirical questions. So, and it's been what, 40, 45 years since Beck's ideas came out, and very few people have tried to falsify them. They just assume they're true because they can be used to frame a certain style of research that seems to be true in its result. But all you have is basically a group of people who are tacitly agreeing not to ask questions about the real world, and then which again is kind of like religious thinking. Just assume if this is true, then this is what we can do to make it look like we're being scientists. I don't know. I don't have a high opinion of that type of research. Yeah, so Democrats with high science knowledge are especially likely to have positive views of environmental researchers, but this is true of Republicans as well. So the more knowledge you have of science, the more trust you have in scientists, um, admitting that there's scientific fraud that goes on. It's just that most science that's really good is obviously good and is replicable. Um, and people, if people understand the scientific process and understand how difficult it is, or that in that scientific process, poor research tends to get filtered out and ignored, you have more faith in it. Okay, but again, if that faith goes up, that doesn't necessarily refute Beck's theory, but Beck's theory doesn't have the ability to explain to us why someone's trust in science might go up the more knowledge they have about science. Because really, his theory might predict that people's ambivalence would go up the more they know about science because they'd be hyper attuned to the negative consequences of science. So now I'm going to move on to some qualitative research. And this is by Nora McKendrick of Rutgers University, who I happen to go to graduate school with. So she's an environmental researcher who does largely qualitative research. There's a little bit of quantitative stuff in there. And in these two studies here that you could look up yourself, she does two interesting things. One, she looks at how the media frames body burdens. And in the second piece of research, she looks at how people respond to the news about body burdens. Okay, so a body burden is basically the, what is it? It's the, I know what it is. It's basically the amount of toxicity that our bodies take on as we live in a contemporary world. So there are various ways for toxins to get into our bodies. It could be through gas fumes, off-gassing from your walls or off-gassing from a new carpet or mattress. These things are toxic. It could be having arsenic or lead in your water. It could be having various contaminants in your food. It could be having genetically altered food that you're unaware of. So body burdens are basically this broad description of ways that things get into your body that normally wouldn't be there. Okay, so for McKendrick's first piece of research, she looked at how the Canadian news media framed the bioaccumulation as a problem that individuals can address through green consumption and by gaining knowledge about food and products that increase their or their family's risk of toxic exposure in food and household products. So basically what she found was that the news, the mass media in Canada, and I think she just explored the Toronto newspapers, journalists informed readers that of the dangers of eating certain foods or having certain products in the household, and then suggested ways to have more green consumption patterns to avoid bioaccumulation. But nowhere, or very rarely in the social media or the news media in Canada, did journalists address governments or industries' accountability or culpability in bioaccumulation. So in Canada, we have very different rules than in the States. They're actually, in some ways, more lax than in the US. So for instance, if you've read this week's chapter in the Young textbook, where he talks about BP, what is it? BDP? BDP. So BDP is a plastic additive, basically, that's kind of simulates estrogen in the body. It was actually created as an estrogen therapy, I believe. But it's really good at making plastics harder. And in the US, it's been banned from all cans, whereas in Canada, you're still allowed to line the interior of cans for canned food with BDP. And you don't have to label it. So in Canada, the Canadian government, even though this is a known toxin, it can, especially if you're a child, it can really affect your brain development. And if you're a woman, it will affect your hormones. It can actually cause early, what is it? Early menopause, if you have a lot of EDP in your system. But because it's an estrogen, similar to estrogen, it just affects your body. So in Canada, our industry does not have to label its products of having BDP. In the States, more and more industries do. So if you are concerned about your health, it might be harder in relation to this issue in Canada to eliminate BDP from your diet or your exposure. Okay, and in part, she's saying that this is because the news media kind of lets government or industry off the hook. Now, this isn't a confirmation of Beck, but it does allow us to understand why Beck's theories are intuitively true to us, because that would, that makes me feel like Beck is right? Because I do feel like the Canadian government and provincial government should have rules and regulations to mandate that all of us get to make decisions in our personal lives with as much information as possible. So the industry has the ability to label cans with the warning that what's in the can says BDP. There's obviously precedents for this. Look at any tobacco product in Canada is going to have all these horrific imagery and warnings on them, which are true. I wish they weren't true, but they are. So it's not like the Canadian government doesn't have the capacity to force industry to warn people of dangerous products and then allow individuals to make the decision about whether they want to consume those products. Canada has the ability to do this, but they don't. The same thing, incidentally, and this is really important, if you're a pet owner, there is no regulation over pet food in Canada. So pets are considered livestock, and pet food manufacturers have absolutely no legal requirement to list what's really in their foods or to tell the truth about what's in the food. So they could say that their pet food is 100% meat. It doesn't have to be, because the Canadian regulations on pet food don't demand it. Okay, so again, if you're like shocked at that, well, that gives us some maybe anecdotal confirmation of Beck's theories, but really what it actually does is it tells us that there's a failure in the Canadian government to really look out for people's interests, right? So if people are interested in their pets, and research shows that people are increasingly concerned about their pets' well-being, while the Canadian government is not responding to citizens and voters and guests' real-life concerns. Industry is not going to do anything on their own without pressure. So if the Canadian government is providing no pressure, and if activists are not providing sufficient pressure, or if consumers are not providing sufficient pressure, industries are not going to do anything either. Now, the second part of McKendrick's research, and she does other things too, she doesn't just focus on body burns, but she found that there's inequality in how people try to use precautionary consumption, and that's usually mothers and wives within heterosexual families who take on the responsibility to protect everybody's body from bioaccumulation. And this results in a lot of guilt and stress because mothers do not want to pass on toxins to their babies, and they don't want their husbands or partners to die prematurely due to bioaccumulation, body burdens. So anyway, yeah, so none of this necessarily is a solid empirical disqualification of Beck's theories, but it is a start at looking at why it is we believe certain theories over others. The only theories that we should believe are theories that have solid evidence, and theories that cannot be falsified easily are not social scientific theories. So Beck's theory about the risk society which again, I am attracted to at an intuitive level, just like many people are. And his writings are good. Our writings are interesting. And I don't mind theories sometimes that cast a wide net. But if we never get down to the hard work of creating empirical studies, qualitative or quantitative, to test those theories or see if they're really useful, then the theories themselves are just religious ideas. They're just ideas of that people take on faith and then organize, in this case, intellectual life around. And I think that we're looking at important issues such as environmental degradation or body burdens or the rise in cancer from pollution. We need to be responsible social scientists and do the real work. Doing pretend science or pretend social science that just starts with the assumption that a theory is true, and then doing such poor research that it doesn't tell us anything, we're actually doing more harm in this case, right? So in some forms of sociology, that's not going to matter. But when we're talking about people's health or the health of the planet, then as social scientists who are interested in those issues, we would want to make sure that our theories or our characterizations of the problems are actually empirically true to the best of our ability. Right? So new data can always come about that will refute widely held, empirically tested beliefs, but that's the way science unfolds. We take the bulk of the evidence and we try to figure out what is probably true at this point in time, but we have to be open to revision. We have to be open to dropping theories that no longer have evidence. And when we do that, we're more likely to get closer and closer and closer to the real issues at stake, or the real, in this case, environmental issues. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you guys have a good week, and I will have another lecture for you soon.